Table was set the way my mother always insisted, cloth napkins folded into triangles, the good plates that only came out twice a year, a candle she'd probably bought at TJ Maxx and convinced herself was from a boutique. I remember standing at the kitchen counter slicing bread and thinking that everything felt exactly right. My brother had been home for 3 days, and for 3 days the house had smelled like coffee and pie and something I could only call relief. My husband was quiet. That wasn't unusual. He's always been the kind of man who listens more than he speaks, who stores things away behind his eyes and waits. I admired that quality as much as I'd married him. But that evening, watching him pass the green beans to my father without making eye contact with my brother, I felt something shift in my chest. Not alarm, not yet, just a small cold current under everything warm. My brother's name is Nolan. He's 4 years older than me, which puts him at 36, and for as long as I can remember, he's been the story our family told about itself. The one who served, the one who serviced. When he came back from his second deployment, my mother cried in the driveway for 10 minutes before she could let go of him. My father, who had maybe cried twice in my lifetime, shook his hand and then hugged him so hard I thought something might break. I loved my brother the way you love something you've been told to love your entire life, and then discovered on your own that you actually did. My husband's name is Garrett. He's 38 and he spent 11 years working for a federal agency, doing work he still doesn't talk about in specific terms. He uses words like analysis and assessment the way other people use words like meetings and spreadsheets. When we were dating, I once asked him what he actually did all day. He smiled and said, "I figure out when people are lying." I laughed. I thought he was being dramatic. I know better now. We'd been married for 4 years when Nolan came home for Thanksgiving. Not home. Nolan lives in Boise now, works in private security consulting, or that's what he's always said. He doesn't talk much about the specifics. I'd always assumed that was a habit left over from the military. You get trained to hold things close, I figured. You stop explaining yourself because for years no one required an explanation. The night everything shifted, we were sitting around the table after dessert. My mother had made her pecan pie, the one she only makes when Nolan's around because he's the only one who really eats it. My father was telling a story about his golf game. The dog was sleeping under Nolan's chair the way she always did, like she'd been waiting for him. Garrett leaned over to me. His voice was barely above a whisper. He said, "I need you to let me run a background check on your brother." I didn't react. I didn't know how to react. I set down my fork very carefully and looked at the table and said quietly, "What?" "Not now," he said. "Just yes or no." "Can I?" I looked up at Nolan. He was laughing at something my father had said, his head thrown back, completely at ease. The dog's tail thumped against the floor. "What did you see?" I asked. Garrett just looked at me. "Yes or no?" I said yes. And then I picked up my fork and finished my pie and smiled when my father finished his story and I didn't say a word. That night I couldn't sleep. Garrett was already asleep beside me, or doing a convincing impression of it, and I lay on my back staring at the ceiling, thinking about my brother's laugh at dinner. The way it had sounded exactly like it always did. Warm, easy, real. I thought about the time Nolan drove 4 hours to help me move into my first apartment after college. He'd shown up with a truck and a bag of sandwiches from the deli I'd mentioned once 6 months earlier in a text. He remembered things like that. Small things. He paid attention. I thought about the time he called me from overseas, just to check in, and talked for 45 minutes about nothing. A movie he'd watched, a book someone in his unit had recommended, the weather. I'd been going through something difficult at the time and hadn't told him, and I always wondered if he'd somehow known. I wasn't ready to find out that I'd been wrong about him, but I'd also watched Garrett work long enough to know that he didn't say things like that without reason. He didn't speculate. He didn't react. He observed, and then he moved carefully, and he was almost never wrong. Around 2 in the morning, I turned toward him in the dark. "What didn't line up?" I asked. He was quiet for long enough that I thought maybe he really was asleep. Then he said, the timeline on his second deployment. He mentioned being in Kandahar in the spring, but he also mentioned the base closure, which happened the previous fall. I didn't say anything in the moment because I wasn't sure I'd heard him right. I waited. And then at dinner he mentioned his unit by the wrong designation. Twice. I felt cold. He could have misspoken. He could have, Garrett said. People misspeak. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. The background check came back 2 days after Thanksgiving. Nolan had already driven back to Boise by then. The house had gone quiet the way it always did after he left. My mother moving a little slower, my father watching television with the volume too low. The dog checking the front door every few hours. Garrett set me down at the kitchen table, our kitchen table, back home, 2 states away, and laid a printed document in front of me. He didn't say anything while I read it. It took me 3 passes to understand what I was looking at. Nolan had enlisted, that was true. He'd gone through basic training, that was true. He'd been deployed once, not twice, and he'd come home after 8 months with an administrative separation. Not honorable, not dishonorable. Administrative. A category that sits in between, issued for a range of reasons, and in Nolan's case the reason was listed as a pattern of conduct violations that didn't reach the threshold of court-martial but couldn't be overlooked. There was no second deployment. There was no Kandahar. There was no commendation, no unit citation, nothing that matched the version of the story our family had been telling for years. I sat with that for a long time. Then I said, very quietly, "How long have you suspected?" Garrett said. "I started noticing inconsistencies about a year ago. Small things. I didn't want to say anything until I was certain." "A year," I said. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know how to bring it up. I was waiting until I had something concrete." I nodded. I understood the logic. I also didn't know how to be in my body for the next several minutes. The hardest part wasn't the lie itself. The hardest part was the math of it. How many dinners, how many holidays, how many moments of my mother crying and my father swelling with pride and my own heart aching with love for this person I'd thought I knew. All of it had been built on something that wasn't there. I didn't call Nolan right away. I spent a week sitting with it first, which I think I needed, and which I also think I'll regret for the rest of my life, because I spent that week being a little colder to him on the phone than I needed to be without being able to explain why. I talked to Garrett a lot during that week, more than I'd expected to. He's not naturally a processing out loud kind of person, but he sat with me through it, and when I said things that didn't make sense, he waited until I found the version that did. He told me once, very carefully, that whatever I decided to do with the information was my decision, that he hadn't done this to blow anything up. He'd done it because he loved me, and he didn't want me building my life on something false. I believed him. I also needed a few days to not be furious at him for being right. The night I decided to call Nolan, I sat on the back porch with a glass of water and practiced what I was going to say. I had a whole version worked out, calm, measured, structured. I was going to say, "I know. I want to understand. I'm not here to punish you." What actually happened was that he answered on the second ring and said, "Hey, you okay?" And something in his voice, the fact that he could still hear when something was wrong with me, made me start crying before I'd said a single word. There was a long silence. Then Nolan said, "It came out, didn't it?" Not a question. "Yes," I said. Another silence. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Quieter. The easy warmth was still there, but underneath it was something else. Something tired, something that had been waiting. "How much?" he said. "Enough," I said. "The second deployment, the unit, all of it." I heard him exhale, a long, slow breath, like something releasing. "I'm sorry," he said. And then, before I could respond, "I know that's not enough." He drove down the following weekend. We sat at my kitchen table. Garrett made himself scarce, went to the gym and then the hardware store and then the gym again, giving us the whole afternoon. and Nolan talked for almost 2 hours. He told me about the administrative separation. He told me it had happened because of an incident with a superior officer that he'd handled badly, his words handled badly, and that he'd been given the choice of signing a separation agreement or going through a formal process he probably wouldn't have survived. He was 22. He was scared. He signed. He came home to a family who'd spent 8 months calling him a hero, putting his picture on the refrigerator, telling the story at church. He didn't know how to walk back in and say, "Actually, I'm not that." So he didn't. He added a deployment that hadn't happened. He added details, cities, seasons, small specifics to make the whole thing cohere. And then he had to keep adding, keep maintaining, keep managing for over a decade. "I didn't think it would last this long," he said. "At first I thought I don't know, get through the first year and then figure it out. And then it was 2 years, and then it was 5, and by the time I understood what I'd actually built, I didn't know how to dismantle it without destroying everything." I asked him if he'd ever thought about coming clean on his own. He looked at the table for a long time. "Every Thanksgiving," he said. "Every time Dad shakes my hand. Every time, Mom." He stopped. "Yeah, every time." "Then why didn't you?" He looked up at me. "Because I was afraid you'd stop loving me." I didn't say anything for a minute. Then I said, "Nolan, you drove 4 hours to help me move into a one-bedroom apartment with no elevator. You called me from a base in the middle of nowhere just to talk about a book. You remembered a deli I mentioned in a text message in September, and you showed up with sandwiches from it in March." I paused. "You really thought a discharge paperwork issue was going to change any of that?" He looked at me the way people look when they're trying very hard not to cry and not quite succeeding. "I was 22, he said again. "I know," I said. "I know." I said, "I know." The harder conversation was our parents. Nolan and I talked about it for another hour after he stopped crying, which, to be clear, took a while for both of us. We went through the options. He could tell them himself, which he wanted to do. We could tell them together, which I thought might be better. We could wait, which neither of us wanted to keep doing. He asked me what Garrett thought. I said Garrett thought it was Nolan's decision, but that waiting longer would make it harder. Nolan nodded slowly. He said he'd always respected Garrett, even when he hadn't fully understood why I'd married someone who watched everything so carefully. "I think I understand now," he said. "He didn't do it to expose you," I said. "He didn't know what he was going to find. He just knew something was off." "I know," Nolan said. "I'm not angry at him. He exhaled. "I think I'm almost relieved. Is that crazy?" "No," I said. "I think carrying something for 14 years and then not having to anymore might feel like relief." He called our parents the following Tuesday. He drove down to see them in person 2 weeks after that. I wasn't in the room for that conversation, but my mother called me afterward and she talked for 40 minutes. And by the end of it, she wasn't crying anymore. She said the thing that had surprised her most was that Nolan was still Nolan. That sitting across from him while he told them the truth, she'd kept waiting to see a stranger, and she'd just kept seeing her son. My father was quieter about it. He called me separately a few days later, and we talked for a while about not very much. Sports. The weather. At the end, before he hung up, he said, "Your husband's a good man." "I know, Dad. I mean it. It takes guts to do something like that. Most people look the other way." "I know," I said. "Tell him," my father said. I told Garrett that night. He didn't say much. He refilled his coffee and leaned against the counter and looked like a man who was glad something had landed where it was supposed to. Nolan reached out to a veterans organization in his area to get clarity on his paperwork and what, if anything, could be addressed through official channels. He said he didn't know what would come of it. He said it didn't really matter. The record was the record, and he'd made peace with the fact that he couldn't undo what had happened when he was 22. But he wanted to stop performing a version of his service that wasn't true. He wanted to just be what he actually was which was a man who'd served imperfectly and come home carrying more than he should have had to carry alone. He called me on a Sunday afternoon in January. There was snow on the ground where he was, and he'd been out shoveling, and he sounded tired in a way that felt clean rather than heavy. "How are you doing?" I asked. "Better," he said. And then, after a pause, "It's weird. I keep having this experience where I don't have to remember what I've said. Like, I say something, and it just sits there, and I don't have to track it or manage it or build on it. I just said a true thing, and now it's just there. I didn't say anything for a moment. Is that what the last 14 years have been like?" I asked. "Tracking everything?" "Yeah," he said. "Pretty much." I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. About what it costs to maintain a false version of yourself for that long. Not just the emotional weight of it, but the actual cognitive labor, remembering which version you told to whom, keeping the details consistent, living always slightly adjacent to your own life. I thought about my mother, who used to hang his photo in the hallway and point it out to visitors. My father, who told the story at every family gathering with the same pride each time. Me crying in the car after his second homecoming, feeling like I was so lucky to have a brother like him. We hadn't been loving a fiction. We'd been loving Nolan, and Nolan had been there the whole time, underneath the story he built to protect himself. The brother who drove 4 hours with sandwiches. The one who called from far away just to hear my voice. That part was always real. The lie was just a shell he built around himself at 22, when he was scared and young and didn't know another way. And it had hardened over the years until he couldn't find the door anymore. Garrett found the door. He did it because that's who he is. A man who notices the small things and doesn't look away, even when looking away would be easier. I don't know that I could have done what he did. I'd had every opportunity to notice those same inconsistencies over the years, and I'd chosen on some level not to look. Not out of dishonesty, out of love maybe, or something that felt like love. Sometimes I think that's the thing about the people closest to us. We can love them so much we stop seeing them clearly. And sometimes it takes someone who loves you but doesn't need the story to remain intact to say, "Let me look at this. Let me find out what's actually there." What was actually there, in the end, was my brother. Still the same person, just finally standing on solid ground. That first Sunday after everything settled. Not right away, but a few months later, once things had found a new shape, we had dinner at my parents' house again. My mother made the pecan pie. My father told a story about his golf game. The dog slept under Nolan's chair. Nothing looked different from the outside, but under the table, when I reached over and squeezed my brother's hand, he squeezed back, and neither of us had to pretend that everything was fine. It actually was.